today in a fantasy culture. I do not mean a culture of elves and dragons, magic and mages, superheroes and mutant villains, though those and all the other fictitious concepts of our media entertainment form a part of this fantasy culture as well, but rather, and more fundamentally, I mean a culture of unreality. It is a perverse culture, one at odds with our natures as human beings, and one which has been progressively rendering more destructive behaviors into the statistically common. We are submerged in this culture, and being so submerged, do not realize the poison that we breathe on a day-to-day basis. Aside, I would say, from the moments of most profound despair, the most private brokenness felt, whether in passing or long stretches, by the many, and which usually finds itself even then under some kind of suppression. Aside from these moments, the perversity of our culture goes without any clear recognition. The problems causing that despair, or that feeling of brokenness, so think the many, reside neither in the culture in which we live, nor in our own internal deficiencies, but rather in a certain maladaptation between ourselves and the world in which we live. Countless hours and dollars are spent on an ever-growing plurality of attempts to address this supposed maladaptation. On everything from exercise regimens and personal training programs to meditation courses, vitamin supplements to psychotherapy, ever-widening ranges of sexual experiences to magazine subscriptions. All of which may be described as being conceived of as somehow therapeutic, as attempts, that is, at healing the broken relation between the self and the world. Now, mind you, none of these pursuits are intrinsically or necessarily bad, although perhaps the broadening of sexual experience might be, and may in fact be needed. One needs exercise and clarity of thought. One needs nutrition and reading, and though sex is not, precisely speaking, a need, it does form a part of the ordinarily ordered human experience, as, for that matter, does parenthood, which is another issue altogether. But the attitude underlying the undertaking of these therapeutic attempts is the therapeutic attitude, which quite often turns even the legitimately good into something bad. And indeed, small mistakes in the beginning turn into great errors in the end. And we, as a culture, have long since deviated far beyond the small initial mistake. We do not, in other words, know the health that we are seeking, nor how it is that we have become ill, and so we err in ways increasingly far from the good and the true. In consequence, I would say that we face nothing less today than an existential crisis of civilizational hope. For absent a sense and understanding of something towards which we may be moving with some security or faith in that goal's attainment, it becomes increasingly difficult to perform the act of hope. Yet strive today, that is, for particular goals, and we see them either realized or frustrated. Yet all too often, afterwards, whether realized or frustrated, the resonance of the achievement or the failure seems to ring hollow. Some individuals will, having achieved one set of goals, continue further to pursue more, and perhaps more varied or more difficult goals. Or perhaps they will turn to those aforementioned therapeutic pursuits. But each satisfaction, even if it happens to be qualitatively superior to those which have been attained prior, somehow becomes less satisfying on the whole. Something remains missing, and if it cannot be found, or if it is felt to have been lost, one becomes increasingly disillusioned with the act of hope, and increasingly inclined instead toward the act of despair. These words, hope and despair, are words etymologically opposed to one another in Latin. The Latin word for hope is sperare, and the Latin word for despair is desperare, in which the privative prefix of de signifies the rejection and the loss of hope. The word hope, sperare, being the infinitive verb. It's not something which one has, it's not a noun, it's not an adjective, it's a verb, it's an action. And so often, today, we speak of despair as something not that we do, but something which seizes us, as a force outside of ourselves. We conceive of despair as something like a blackness, a void, an emptiness into which we fall or into which we are dragged. The more we find ourselves to experience missing things in our lives, to experience dissatisfaction no matter what we do or in what we place our hopes, the more we ourselves will incline to despair. And thus, despite the love of the true and the good which is rooted in our deepest natural yearnings, we end up submerging ourselves in a black meaninglessness. I am Dr. Brian Kemple, and this is the first lecture in the Ethics, the Good Life seminar. Today's lecture is titled Against the Nihilist Noise, Silence and Music in the Human Soul. Now, we might consider the rise of this culture of nihilistic noise in two distinct ways. One, by a chronological analysis, tracing its roots back in the history of ideas to the thinkers whose dualistic explanations of the natural world, and of the human self most especially, resulted in the fragmentation of all human experience. Or, two, we might consider the growth of nihilism from considering the human being directly, by considering the nature and properties commonly held by every human being, regardless of time or place, which we might call the psychological analysis. Now, the chronological analysis provides a very important study, and one might unearth much of the perverse cultural development by reading, for instance, the third and fourth parts of John Deely's 4 Ages of Understanding, or Charles Taylor's Secular Age, or perhaps the many works of Etienne Gilson and those who have followed in his path, which detail the decline of medieval thought and the rise of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Or one could pick up Richard Weaver's short work, Ideas Have Consequences, or quite a great many other works as well. I think one can find, for instance, a certain thread of historical deviation, for instance, in just reading the 3 thinkers of René Descartes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Not that I mean to pick on the French, it just happens that way. As the first of these, Descartes, divides the mind and the body. The second, Rousseau, divides nature and culture, and the third, Sartre, divides choice from truth. Now, each of these 3, however, serves as a kind of landmark in a landscape which is very complex, with many other thoughts and influences and thinkers. Summarily, therefore, we might say that a failure to understand the continuous constitution of reality between the mind and the world resulted in a series of dualistic fragmentations, one part breaking off from another, breaking off from another, breaking off from another, turning the phenomena of our human experience ever more starkly against one another, making them harder to bring together into a coherent unity. In other words, the acceptance of one bad theoretical postulate seldom has immediate impact upon our lives, but may have a more profound impact on the well-being of the world and humanity as a whole than the most violent of wars and disease. For that one bad theoretical postulate can lead to many, many others, can lead to a fragmentation of the whole human experience, and I think that's in fact the situation that we find ourselves in today. Now, on the other hand, the psychological analysis more directly helps us to understand ourselves and our current situation. And therefore, though it is greatly aided in this endeavor by a chronological study, it provides a more direct remedy to our own culture of despair and fragmentation, as well as a greater understanding of how our fantasy-driven therapy culture masks this underlying nihilistic thinking which has brought us to our current situation. Thus, in this lecture, I'm going to proceed in 3 parts. First, I will provide a brief psychological analysis specifically aimed at understanding how it is that we human beings are essentially capable of falling into meaninglessness. Second, I will look at the therapeutic culture which is currently obscuring and thereby perpetuating this nihilistic bent. And third, I will provide an indication of how we, in this seminar, will learn to perform the act of hope instead of allowing ourselves to be seized by the act of despair. Now, the human experience of despair really ought to strike us as something quite unique, for despair is really unlike the other kinds of sadness that we experience in our lives. That is, although despair, like all emotional affectivities, is something felt, it nevertheless has something distinctly intellectual or cognitive in its experience. Animals do not experience despair. Grief? Yes, absolutely. A certain perceptual affectivity at an absent or a lost good? No doubt. But not despair. This is because they lack the requisite psychological structure to have such an experience. Now, if we're going to understand what despair really is, this unique, odd, uniquely human thing, we have to understand hope. We can't understand the de sperare unless we understand the sperare, since desperare is a rejection or a loss of hope. Now, simply put, hope is a virtue, a habit, that is, whereby we are made better. And while there is in Catholic theology an understanding of hope as a virtue given through grace, there is also an ordinary and natural sense of the virtue as well. And here I think we can rely on the wisdom of St. Thomas Aquinas for some guidance. As he writes in his Disputed Questions on the Virtues, which I'll first read and then explain, he says, "Because a habit is known through its act, and an act is known through its object, it is necessary to consider the intelligible rationale of the action of hope, to know whether it is a virtue. Now, it is manifest that to hope implies a certain motion of the appetitive faculty tending toward a good, not as something already had, as in the case of joy and delight, but as something pursued, as in something desired and longed for. Hope differs from desire, however, in 2 ways. First, because desire is commonly of any good whatsoever, and therefore is attributed to the concupiscible appetite, while hope is of the arduous good, which is difficult to pursue, and therefore is attributed to the irascible appetite. Second, because desire is of some good absolutely, without consideration of its possibility or impossibility, but hope tends towards some specific good, as toward that which is possible to obtain, for it implies in its intelligible rationale a certain security of obtainment. Thus, therefore, in the object of hope, there are 4 things to be considered. First, that it is something good, through which the object of hope differs from the object of fear. Second, that it is a good to be had in the future, through which the object of hope differs from that of joy or delight. Third, that it is an arduous good, through which it differs from desire. And fourth, that it is a possible good, through which it differs from despair. Now, to begin my explanation of this passage, it must be known that Aquinas broadly divides the key faculties of the human soul into those that are apprehensive and those that are appetitive. Apprehension deals with cognition, with the grasping of things as knowable, while the appetitive deals with seeking, the attempt at obtaining a unity with the objects that we have apprehended. Appetites are further divided into concupiscible, wherein something is adjudged by us as desirable for union, irascible, wherein something is adjudged by us as involving an obstacle to a desired good, and volitional, wherein we consider something good as such, and not merely good in a particular respect. These appetites are not mutually exclusive, but often coincide as to their objects. That is, in fact, to have an irascible appetite, there has to be something of the object which is recognized as good, but that there's an obstacle in the way. And so that's where the irascibility, the ire, the anger comes from. The determination, the effort to overcome is what belongs to the irascible. That's what Aquinas is saying here by talking about it as an arduous good, as the object of hope. Now, regarding any object pertaining to virtue, though, the volitional is always at least implicitly involved, for only through volition can we involve an appetition for what is truly good, for a good which is intellectually recognized as such. Not just something which is a sensory desire, but something that we know is good, requires that we have an act of will involved. Understand more clearly what it is Aquinas is saying here about the object of hope, the action of hope, and indeed the virtue of hope. The object that is an arduous future and possible good. By its being arduous, it is differentiated from an object of desire which does not essentially require our struggling to attain it. I mean, it may require a struggle incidentally, but there's nothing essentially difficult about an object of desire. If I am thirsty, the water in the glass on my desk is an object of desire. I don't really have to hope for the water in my desk. I'm able to move myself. I'm able to pick up the glass. I'm able to drink it. There's nothing there which is arduous about that. Now, if I were to say in the desert and dying of thirst, then water would perhaps become an object of hope because it would be arduous. It would be difficult to find, difficult to attain. Now, that is to say that desire usually presents itself, or an object of desire is usually presented as a kind of immediately possible attainment of whatever good it presents. So usually these sorts of concupiscible goods are those of physical pleasure or satiation. Water to quench thirst, food to quench or satisfy hunger, sex, massage, some sort of physical comfort, and so on and so forth. Now, with regards to hope, by the object being in the future, this entails that we have not yet obtained it. As it should be fairly obvious, unlike when we experience joy or delight, we have an object that we have attained. And it may have been an arduous good, but it's there, it's present, it's not something as yet unrealized. You cannot take joy in something which you do not yet possess. Then it's only a matter of hope or desire or something along those lines. By the object of hope being possible, this means that we can see that, we believe that we can, even though there may be obstacles, that we can overcome these obstacles, that they are not insurmountable. And though the good may be remote from us, though it may be far away from where we are now, its attainment is not out of keeping with our nature and our faculties. And it is this lattermost quality, this possibility of the attainment of the good, as Aquinas says, that differentiates hope from despair. For in despair, we don't cease to believe that there exists or that there could exist some good, but we believe that it isn't possible for us to attain it, either because the good itself can't be realized, or because we ourselves cannot realize the good or cannot receive the good, that we're not worthy of it, that we're not capable of bringing it to realization. And the word belief here is a word which I think we can talk about quite a bit, perhaps in our discussion session, but belief consists essentially in the intellectual conviction of the truth of some proposition, such that we, given the chance, will act in accordance with it. So if you believe that gravity is a force, and you drop something, you're going to act to try and catch it or to pick it up or something along those lines. If you believe that God is real, you're going to act in accordance with that belief. You're going to make your choices on the presupposition that there is an order to the universe, a purpose, a meaningfulness to it, perhaps an afterlife, so on and so forth. If you don't believe that God is real, you're going to choose differently. You're going to not act with the belief necessarily that there's an essential ordering to the universe, since order seems to imply or entail some sort of deity or some sort of causal agent responsible for things being why they are the way they are. And so our beliefs determine our actions in that way, and that's a very important thing that I think we really probably should discuss to some extent. At any rate, in despair, when we have the act of despair, or when we act with despair, either we believe the arduousness of the good that is the difficulty preventing us from getting at the good, we believe that that is insurmountable, or believe perhaps that the distance in time or place between ourselves and the object is too far, or believe the self is inadequate to effecting or meriting its attainment, or that something else prohibits our possibility of seizing and being united with that good. Now, when we know this good only vaguely or dimly or confusedly, the possibility of its attainment becomes cloudy, and the inclination to despair stronger. Most of all, when we do not believe that there is a good out there that we can obtain, but that goodness is only something subjectively determined by our own evaluations. As a consequence, any society, any culture in which there exists a certain preponderance of noise will be a culture or society that contributes towards a nihilistic and despairing attitude. For a culture of noise is one which obscures the discovery of the good. And because the noise obscures the underlying therapeutic attitude that so many of us have unconsciously developed or bought into somehow, the noise that is of superficial aspirations and fabricated rather than discovered meaning by which we are hourly bombarded today, because of this obscurity, we thereby have a sort of belief, whether we realize it fully consciously or not, that by the right means, we might rectify these broken, fragmented, disturbing relations between ourselves and all of the various noise-producing elements of the world. That we might, in other words, truly affect or attain a therapeutic resolution for those dismaying feelings of being out of sorts with the world. Now, my intent is not to besmirch therapy as such. I think therapy may be a valuable and perhaps even an invaluable means to righting our lives when they have gone off track. And I think counseling is something that many of us probably need even when we haven't gone off track, but in order to help us to thrive. But therapy, specifically this attempt to heal or to resolve ourselves in some way with the world, I think that this is something which we need to draw attention to. This notion of therapy culture, as Elizabeth Lash Quinn terms it in our reading for this week. And so as she writes on the bottom of page 10, Freudian theory articulates the vital role of sublimation, but it disregarded religious belief, thereby depriving sublimation of any deeper meaning than personal adjustment. Sublimation here meaning broadly the transference of natural energies into socially and culturally productive and acceptable activities. And so, though the psychological and psychiatric disciplines have evolved and changed and shifted considerably since the time of Sigmund Freud, the notion of psychotherapy as a means of adjusting ourselves to better living persists. Only now, instead of being limited to the reclined couch and caricatures of talking about one's dreams and relationships with parents, the therapeutic has wormed its way into everything. Into movies and television, self-help books and video games and workout programs and dating advice and columns and applications, workplace seminars and training, and really nearly anywhere one might look. All of these spouting the propaganda of finding oneself or discovering meaning or becoming happy with oneself and so on and so forth. Thus it is that Lash Quinn gives a thorough and I would say excoriating exposition of therapy culture in our reading, and it is worth repeating it here, this from page 18. As she writes, her expanded definition of the therapeutic would include a view of the self as top priority and endpoint, interpersonal relations as instrumental toward that end, the self's pursuit of projects of self-interest, mandated self-expression without structure and inhibition, enlistment of emotion and reason in furtherance of those projects, manipulative relations with others and with the self, an externalist vantage point on the self, as if seeing the self through the eyes of others, the dominance of the health paradigm as the basis for self-assessment, a functionalist physical and psychological model of health, that is, health as the ability to function within an unquestioned social order, pop psychology as explanatory apparatus, a process orientation and programmatic solutions, social engineering, the monopoly of professional expertise over life skills, a seesaw between dependence and independence in place of interdependence, moral non-judgmentalism, deprivation of personal life, a rarefied level of self-consciousness, and the absence of a transcendent commitment beyond the individual. It's quite a list, and a number of the descriptions, I think, strike home for articulating what many of us have likely noticed in our society, but perhaps not had brought out into our explicit awareness. 2 points in particular, however, really stuck out to me. The first is a seesaw between dependence and independence in place of interdependence. And the second, a functionalist physical and psychological model of health. That is, health is the ability to function within an unquestioned social order. I think the former, this seesaw, explains much of the incoherence evinced in the rest of the list. That is, this deprivation of personal life simultaneous with a rarefied level of self-consciousness, or the view of the self as top priority, together with an externalist vantage point on the self, and so on and so forth. We have, that is, by believing it our default state, severed ourselves from each other, cut ourselves off into isolated psychological islands by thinking that we are essentially minds, that we are essentially psychological subjectivities, only incidentally related to one another through external physical means. And yet, this severance, this cutting off of oneself from the other, is so profoundly contrary to our nature that in consequence we sway wildly from insisting upon our self-determining personhood, our individuality, our independence, to, on the other hand, experiencing and expressing a radical feeling of need for others, a need for their validation, for their approval, their support, for their being with us, for their elevating of us. And thus, I think the precarity of the second point that I said stuck out to me, the functionalist model of health, an idea which we see exemplified physically in the idea of a gold standard for a healthy body, a standard of universalized quantitative measurement ranges, such as with one's cholesterol or blood pressure, and exemplified, on the other hand, psychologically in the notion that mental health is the absence of internal disturbance while acting within a paradigm of what is considered socially normal or acceptable. Again, by a kind of quantitative measurement range, but this range, this mental health range, being even more arbitrarily determined than that of physical health. For the means of measuring psychological phenomena are far less accurate and reliable than those of measuring corporeal phenomena. Yet, despite the absurdity, a great many people have bought, consciously or not, into these notions, mostly through the subtle education which is received at the hands of what is often called popular entertainment, but as Lash Quinn says quite insightfully, really ought to be called popular education. Our therapeutic sense of self-rectitude, that is, finds itself amplified and confirmed through the fantasy environment which affects us on levels deeper than perceived by our explicit consciousness. We internalize the fantasies seen on our screens as ideal ways of living, the romanticized lives of a fabricated meaning, and are continually disappointed, without even realizing it, that our own lives lack that romanticism, that we do not have the provided for us contexts of meaning ready-made into which we might fall. And so we seek increasingly therapeutic resolutions, either to make our lives seem more like the fantasies and thereby experience disappointment at our success in a way we perhaps weren't anticipating, for we discover that the fabricated meanings are mere fictions, or conversely, we seek this therapeutic resolution to make ourselves more comfortable with the reality of an exterior meaninglessness. And so to this end, all the aforementioned pursuits, whether of fitness, romance, organization, efficiency training, life hacking, entertainment, subcultures, websites, even philosophy, all these pursuits find themselves being aggressively appropriated by the therapeutic culture. That is, in the absence of a belief in exterior meaning, in meaning independent of ourselves, independent of our own evaluations, it is proposed that we must develop meaning for ourselves. We might find it in philosophy, or in joining a gym, or starting a new relationship, that these things might therapeutically resolve our mental health dysfunction and allow us to subside into a standard and normative pattern of behavior of doing what makes us happy without hurting anyone else. It should then be no wonder that so many today lack in hope and exceed in despair. For everything in our culture being appropriated by this therapeutic mentality, this therapeutic attitude, seems bent upon, in fact, obscuring, occluding, and directing us away from hope for any good which could be truly meaningful for what we are as human beings. And so, if we are to obtain a freedom from this despairing, nihilistic, therapeutic cycle, we must necessarily learn to perform the act of hope. The act, that is, which believes in the possible attainment of an arduous future good. As pointed out earlier, to have an act of hope requires that we have an object of hope. It can be difficult to see the object of hope in this life. That is, we may, if we possess faith in a higher power, or if we have belief in an afterlife, we may hope for a blessed state of existence consequent to that in which we now dwell, and therefore we may have some object of hope. But this alone, this remote, distant, hard to see, hard to imagine object, alone against the nihilistic world in which we live, quite naturally is very hard to maintain as a compelling source of attraction for our day-to-day lives. Beatitude, in other words, is remote, and though we may hope for it, its attainment is something not within our natural reach. So what then, what should be, what could be our object of earthly hope? To answer this, I think a scholastic distinction will be of great benefit to us, namely the distinction between formal and material objects. Now, first and most generally, in the scholastic vocabulary, the word object, and this is how I almost always use it myself, the word object is not synonymous with thing. The objective is not that which is out there independent of our minds. In fact, it's quite the opposite. For the word object signifies that which is precisely as it is in relation to some subject, and specifically a subject having cognitive and appetitive faculties. Before I look at it or think about it or anything of that nature, the door to my office is not an object. Only once I look at it or I think about it does it become an object. So the pasta that I'm going to eat for dinner tonight is an object because I am thinking of it and because I am intending to perform an action upon it. Therefore, in its objectivity, there are two factors whereby it is constituted as an object. There is the formal and the material. The formal object can be considered as a complex. That is, that it is pasta and not pizza constitutes part of its formal objectivity, as does its purpose of being edible and having nutrients and even being desirable. That it is this particular dish of pasta, made with those particular noodles, that particular sauce, that particular cheese, and so on, this collection of particulars constitutes the material objectivity. The material object, that is, in other words, instantiates the meanings presented in the formal object. Or to give another and a broader example, we could say that the formal object of hunger is food, and the material object, or what is relatively material to that formality, is this or that particular kind of food. Sometimes you're hungry, but not just for any food, you're hungry for pasta or pizza or for chicken cacciatore, who knows. Now, similarly, the formal object of hope is that aforementioned arduous future and possible good. It's with regard to the material objectivity, however, that today we encounter a serious difficulty. For the nihilistic noise of today makes those material objects of the here and now, wherein we might find the object of hope at least partially instantiated, makes that object very difficult to discern, and even more difficult to hold on to once it has been discerned. What we see in our world today, therefore, are diminished possibilities for those goods in which one once placed a temporal and worldly hope. Family, true love, meaningful work, opportunity to do good for and in one's community, one's state, one's country. In short, purposefully driven and structured lives. Young men, for instance, today see young women increasingly turn to pornographic or even semi-pornographic enterprises as an easy way for them to earn a living, or at least an audience, and thus the young men despair of love and family. Simultaneously, they look at the career paths open to them, and apart from highly selective and competitive fields, few offer solidity, stability, decent compensation, or the sense of doing work that matters. Most are mere paper pushers or facilitators of a consumerist economy that devalues products of real quality, preferring the economically expedient. Ownership of property becomes decreasingly feasible. Acquisition of wealth, seemingly the occurrence of good fortune, chance, or more likely than not, nepotism. But this absence, this deprivation, this lack of material instantiations of the good for which we might hope, well, this too is an illusion of our fantasy-driven culture, or the belief that these are the only goods after which we might seek is something foisted upon us by that fantasy culture. And yet, not even a total deprivation of material instantiations can destroy the possibility of the formal good's realization. And this, too, is a good for which we may hope, a good of human beings being good humans, of a metaphysical necessity, namely that anything, insofar as it is good, and much of the evil that we see and hear and experience today comes not from something which is, but from something which is not, most especially from a lack of the right order of relations, a lack which we may fill, a good which we may restore. In conclusion, then, there is, I would say, a kind of studious effort practiced by many today in avoiding any sort of deep self-reflection. On the contrary, there exists an ever-spreading and ever louder industry bent on selling us a means to ignore true consideration of ourselves, and instead to pursue a fantasizing therapy of self-invention, masked under 1,000 different guises, to be sure, but with the same underlying rotten culture at its core. It is a lie that deprives us of the will to perform the act of hope. It pushes us into the teetering, seesawing, dualistic, continually tense struggle of trying to produce meaning instead of discovering it. It puts upon our backs the whole weight of the universe. And the result, inevitably, is a fragmented and broken personhood. But we do not need to capitulate to this fragmented view of the self. Rather, we need to take up the mantle of struggle, the mantle of thinking about who and what we really are, that we might discover through what it means to be human, how we might not only hope for a final beatitude in the next life, but how really to live well here and now. How, that is, to ignore the noise and discover in the resonance of our own souls as intellectual and loving beings what is the opposite of noise, that is either music or silence. So thank you for joining me. I look forward with great pleasure to our conversation in all the weeks to come.